Let me start by asking a question. How do you know that God exists? This is the interactive portion of the program. How do you know? How do you know that God exists? Creation? What's that? We exist. Anybody? Fulfilled prophecy. What's that? The Bible. We have the Bible. Miracles. Morality. Israel. A witness of the Holy Spirit. What's that? Holy Spirit. Science. History. By faith. Blind faith? Well, we wouldn't know it by blind faith, but we might believe it. How do we know? Not just show or not just think. How do we know God exists? Evidence. You've given some of it already. We know God by his effects. Some of you have mentioned it. Creation. If there's a creation, there must be a creator. The creation is the effect. The creator is the cause. If there's design, that's the effect. You reason back to a cause of designer. Somebody mentioned morality. Well, morality is an effect. There's a moral law written on the heart. We reason back to a moral law giver. If there's evidence that, say, a man predicted and accomplished his own resurrection from the dead, that's the effect. You reason back to a cause. Who could cause somebody to predict and accomplish his own resurrection from the dead? Only somebody like God. In fact, you do this personally. If you think God has said something to you, or you say you had some answered prayer, you're doing the same thing. The effect is the answered prayer. You're saying the cause is God. You always reason from effect back to cause. That's what scientists do. Actually, the Apostle Paul tells us how we know that God exists. In Romans chapter 1, after he does the introduction, he begins to talk about how all of us are fallen. And he says this: the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. There is nobody who is honest with themselves who doesn't know God exists. Everybody knows there's a creator because there's a creation. Everybody knows there's a designer because, or there's design. There's a designer because there's design. Everyone knows this cause is moral because you have the moral law written on your heart. Now, just from knowing this doesn't mean you know Jesus is God. You'd need more information like the resurrection of Jesus to know this. But just from the natural world, you know there has to be a moral creator out there because you're reasoning from effect to cause. However, some atheists will say this is not true. Richard Dawkins, probably the most famous atheist in the world and a big proponent of macroevolution, says this. He said, it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. Very understated, wouldn't you say? What? Ignorant, stupid, insane, or maybe even wicked? Look, either we were created or we weren't. There's no other possibility. Dawkins is saying that if you think you were created, you're stupid. So what I want to do this morning is to ask this question. Does science and Christianity conflict? Because you often hear it does from people like Richard Dawkins. And much of what I'm going to say is in this book, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. We're going to cover a lot this morning, and we're just going to set this question up because tonight we're going to come back and talk specifics. We're going to talk who created the universe or what created the universe, who created life or what created life and new life forms. We're going to cover that tonight. But I just want to deal with the question of, is it even possible that science can show that Christianity is true? Or is science and Christianity in conflict? So this morning we're going to do 4 things. First thing we're going to deal with is, what is science? If we're going to talk about science, we got to define it, right? Second question is, what does science say about God? I think you're actually going to be surprised to the answer to that question. And then third question is, how does science and atheism conflict? Because my thesis here this morning is not that science and Christianity conflicts. Actually, science and atheism conflicts. And we're going to unpack that. And then we're going to deal with the final question, why does science need God? Because my thesis is science needs God. If there was no God, you couldn't do science. So what we're going to do is start here at point 1, what is science? You guys ready to go? All right. Now, if someone were to put a microphone in front of your face and say, sir or ma'am, what is science? What would you say? Observations, part of it. A theory, I'm hearing words. Research. What would be the definition, though? Discovery. Well, you discover things even without doing science. Science, of course, is just a word that means knowledge. But I think if we had to put a definition on it, and this is actually a bit controversial, what the actual definition of science is, but I think this is pretty good. A basic definition is, science is a method of inquiry used to discover cause and effect relationships. When you're doing science, you're trying to discover what particular cause caused a particular effect that you observe. In fact, Francis Bacon, the father of modern science, said this: science is a search for causes. Science is a search for causes. When we're doing science, that's what we're doing. We're trying to figure out what particular cause caused a particular effect. And there are 2 types of causes, only 2. Either the cause is intelligent, like a person, or the cause is not intelligent, like a natural process. Either the cause is intelligent or it's not. Those are the only 2 options, right? In fact, let me give you an illustration of both of these causes. How many people in here have been to the Grand Canyon? Have you ever been to the Grand Canyon, right? It's a beautiful geologic formation. But if you're a scientist and you're trying to discover what caused the Grand Canyon, do you have to posit some intelligent being created the canyon? Or is it possible that a natural cause or causes created the canyon? What do you think the answer is? Natural causes, right? Wind, rain, erosion can create a canyon. In fact, if we take a lot of water and put it on a dirt mass, we're going to get a canyon. We can do it over and over again, right? Or even a great flood can create a canyon, right? But can everybody see the difference between this geologic formation and this geologic formation? Mount Rushmore, right? Certainly Mount Rushmore was not caused by erosion. Not natural erosion, maybe political erosion. Why? Because you can take wind, rain, water, a whole bunch of natural forces, throw it at rock, you'll never get the 4 presidents by doing that. You realize that this requires an intelligent cause. So all we're saying here is the Grand Canyon is an example of a natural cause or natural process, and Mount Rushmore is an example of an intelligent cause or an intelligent process, an intelligent person. You guys with me so far? All right. Now, in addition to there being 2 types of causes, there are also 2 types of science. And this is very important if we're going to uncover whether or not Christianity and science conflict, because a lot of the confusion comes in right here. The main type of science we seem to talk about all the time is empirical science, like how do things operate? How does a Model T operate? How does it work? Right? Laws of internal combustion, we got automotive engineering, right? That's how it works. But there's another type of science that's not empirical, it's not how things operate, it's how things originated. You know, where did the Model T come from to begin with, right? That's a question we need to answer. And too often we confuse these 2, And if we confuse them, we're not going to come to the right conclusion with regard to Christianity and science. In fact, empirical science deals more with technology. You know, how do things operate? And Christians and atheists are not arguing over technology, right? Nobody's arguing over how, like Christians don't have different theories about how the Model T works, or how iPhones work, or how air conditioning works, right? But we might have different theories about how things came into existence, how they were created. Where did this come from? Where did the Model T come from to begin with? That's a different question than how does it operate. In fact, John Lennox, you guys know who John Lennox is? He's an older gentleman now, a brilliant philosopher, mathematician, apologist, taught at Oxford for many years. And he used to ask his students a question. He would say, what caused the Model T? I'm going to give you two possibilities, Henry Ford or the laws of internal combustion. And his students say, Dr. Lennox, you need both. You need Henry Ford to create the Model T, and then you need the laws of internal combustion to be what they are, because if they were to change every 10 minutes, the Model T couldn't operate. So you need both. You need a creator, like Henry Ford, and you also needed an environment, like the laws of internal combustion and those laws, in order to have a Model T at all. And he said, you're absolutely right. Why can't atheists like Richard Dawkins and others see this distinction? Because here's what they're going to say. They're going to say, maybe not directly, but because, well, let me point this out. To say that a scientist can disprove the existence of God is like saying that a mechanic can disprove the existence of Henry Ford, right? Can a mechanic disprove the existence of Henry Ford? No. No matter how much a mechanic understands how the Model T operates, that's not going to necessarily tell him or explain why the Model T exists to begin with, right? They're going to say that because we're really good at technology and we keep advancing in technology, that somehow there's no creator. Those two things do not follow. Just because human beings are getting better and better through accumulated knowledge on how to use our accumulated knowledge and to basically harness the four natural forces we know about to make technological advances, doesn't mean there's no creator or sustainer of this natural world. Because Christians and atheists are not arguing over how Model Ts work or how iPhones work or how air conditioning works, but we are arguing over three big questions. What are the three big questions? Where did the universe come from? Where did life come from? And where did subsequent life forms come from? Those are all questions for historic science, or we might say forensic science. We know forensic science when we do a murder investigation. You can't go back into the lab and recreate the murders. You can't go back in time and witness them. It's not an empirical science. It is a forensic or historical science. You've got to put clues together to figure out what happened in the past. And that's the kind of science you need to do if you're going to discover how the universe came into existence or who created it. Where did life come from and where did subsequent life forms come from? Those are the things we're arguing over. You guys with me so far? All right, now. So what is science? Search for causes. Two types of causes, natural and intelligent. Two types of science, historical science, empirical science. Next question is, what does science say about God? And in order to do this, we've got to talk about OJ. OJ, how many people in here have never heard of O.J. Simpson? You don't know who O.J. Simpson is? Because there's some younger people in here you might not know, okay? O.J. Simpson, back in the 60s, won a Heisman Trophy as a running back for the USC Trojans, went on into the NFL, played most of his career with the Buffalo Bills, one of the best running backs of all time. You may remember many years ago when the Bills used to play the Dolphins, Howard Cosell used to say, he was the announcer, he would say, Miami has the oranges, but Buffalo has the juice. O.J. Simpson, great running back. Well, after he retired, he used to be a sideline reporter for the NFL, and then in 1994, he was accused of two horrific slash and dash murders north of here in Brentwood, California. His ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, was murdered, as well as what many people think was her boyfriend at the time, Ron Goldman. And the trail of blood literally led right to OJ. That's why this Newsweek magazine said trail of blood. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you the evidence and you're gonna be the jury. And you're gonna tell me whether or not you think OJ was guilty or not guilty. Here's the evidence. Simpson's blood was at the scene of the crime. There's only 1 in 170 million chance it wasn't Simpson's blood. Secondly, Goldman, Brown, and Simpson's blood was in Simpson's Bronco. Do you guys remember the low-speed chase on the LA freeway? It wasn't because there was traffic. It was OJ's in the back of this white Bronco, and he's got a gun to his head, apparently. His buddy's driving it. The cops are overhead. Pull over, OJ. We're taking you to prison. Anyway, he finally stopped. They finally took him and ultimately went to trial. We'll get there in a minute. Anyway, the blood of all three of them in that Bronco. Third, the blood at the scene the glove at the scene had blood from all three and matched the glove at Simpson's house. When Simpson was a sideline reporter for the NFL, he would wear, in the colder months, these isotoner gloves. And you'd see him holding the glove or holding the microphone with the glove. Well, one of those gloves was found at the crime scene, drenched in the blood of all three, and the other glove was found at his house. And you might remember his defense attorney, Johnny Cochran, when they were going to take that glove and put it on OJ's hand and see if it fit, he said, if the glove doesn't fit, you must quit. You remember this, right? And there's a dramatic scene where OJ has this surgical glove on, and he's about to try on the glove found at the scene, and he can't quite get it on. Doesn't fit. Well, why didn't it fit? Why couldn't he get it on? It had shrunk due to the blood, and secondly, he didn't want to get it on. Would you? Then the bloody footprints at the scene were from a rare brand of size 12 shoes that Simpson owned. There were only 199 pairs of these shoes sold in America, and OJ had a pair, and those prints were at the scene of the crime. Finally, Brown's blood was on Simpson's socks. There's only a 1 in 21 billion chance it was not her blood. In fact, she's probably the only person in history that had that exact blood type. Now, here's my question, jury. Does science show that OJ was guilty? How many say yes? How many say no? How many say don't answer? It's a trap! Yeah, it's a trap. Why? Why is it a trap? Because science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. Science doesn't say a word. Scientists say things. All data needs to be gathered, and then all data needs to be interpreted. And who does that? Scientists do that. In fact, as a jury, you've got to, figure out, is this good evidence? Maybe it was planted. In fact, some people thought it was planted, right? And then secondly, if it is good evidence, does it more point toward guilt or not guilty? You can't prove someone innocent. All you can say is, well, the prosecution didn't prove their case, so he's not guilty, okay? All right? Yeah, that's exactly right, okay? Now, here's the interesting thing, is that 10 years after the murders, by the way, do you guys remember where you were if you're old enough to remember when the verdict was announced? You usually probably remember where you were. It happened in 1995. OJ was found not guilty. By the way, CNN later did an expose on this whole thing. They interviewed all of the jury members, and they discovered they never would have convicted OJ. Didn't matter what the evidence was. They had decided beforehand he was not guilty. And look, the prosecution didn't do itself any favors. Mark Furman was a racist. They had him on tape talking about that. Marcia Clark, the prosecutor, didn't do a good job. In any event, a survey 10 years after the murders found this. 77% believed Simpson was guilty, but there was an ethnic divide. While 87% of whites thought O.J. was guilty, only 29% of blacks did. Why? Why is there a difference? Worldview, ladies and gentlemen. While blacks may have seen people framed and maybe even had it happen to themselves in the past, they were more open to saying, maybe Furman did all this. O.J.'s a good guy. He wouldn't do this. They're just trying to frame O.J., whereas whites said, I don't see that kind of history. And so there's a difference. Why? Because worldview may determine how you interpret the evidence. If you're open to this being a case, a framed case because of your own experience, you might say he's innocent or not guilty. And if you're not open to that, you'll say, this is obvious, he's guilty. Do you see how the worldview changes how you interpret the evidence? Now, personally, I think he was guilty. In fact, that bumbling LAPD, A, had no motive to frame O.J., and B, this is too intricate to do. They couldn't even run the case. They don't have that kind of ability to frame somebody. For what reason? For those of you who don't know, when he was found not guilty, he later went to prison over armed robbery, and then he got out of prison, and he died, what, maybe 2 years ago? Something like that? Now let's apply this to evolution, this same worldview issue. Have you guys heard of Piltdown Man? Piltdown Man was discovered in 1912 in Piltdown, England, and the British Museum reconstructed fragments of a skull and a jawbone and hailed it as a link between ape and man. However, it wasn't true. It was a hoax. It was revealed as a hoax in 1923. It was a combination of a human skull, orangutan jaw, and chimpanzee teeth, but the scientific community did not concede it for 30 years. Not until 1953 did they say it's a hoax. Why did it take them 30 years to admit it was a hoax when they knew it was a hoax? Because their worldview is evolution has to be true. It's the only theory we have that doesn't include God. So it's got to be true. This is called confirmation bias, right? No matter what they see, it's going to say it's going to be evidence for evolution. Here, the worldview may determine how you interpret the evidence. The same thing is true today. Richard Dawkins, the guy we started with, the evolutionist, was asked by Philip Johnson a number of years ago. Philip Johnson was an attorney at UCal Berkeley. And okay, yeah. But Johnson was actually conservative, and he wrote a book called Darwin on Trial, where he pointed out that the evidence for Darwinism didn't work. So he emailed Richard Dawkins, and he said, hey, Richard, just give me bottom line, what is your best evidence for macroevolution? And here's what he wrote back. This is what Dawkins said. The reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals. You see, we have this genetic code, and all living things have it, and so that's evidence for a common ancestor. Actually, he's not right about that. There are many genetic codes, but he's right that there's one big dominant one, so we'll give him some grace there. So he's saying, because we all have this same kind of code, what we call DNA, that shows we have a common ancestor. And Dawkins could be right about that, but he's leaving something out. There's another possible cause. Remember the two causes? Natural cause, intelligent cause. What's the other possible cause that could explain a common genetic code? A common creator or a common designer, right? In fact, when you try and answer the question, just where did we come from? If you want to take the arguments for macroevolution and boil them down, the two main arguments for macroevolution are what is known as DNA and homology. What he just said, common genetic code, and homology, which means structure. Yeah, we kind of do look like we could be related to apes, right? We have a common structure. Of course, what they never tell you is, yeah, we look like apes, but that's because we don't look like snakes or trees either, but we're supposed to be related to them as well, okay? But they'll say, okay, we have this common genetic code, and we look like apes, so we have a common ancestor. That's what they'll say. But when you ask them, hey, why couldn't that be evidence of a common designer? They're going to say, well, because evolution's true. And then you ask them, why is evolution true? And they say, because of DNA and homology. Can anybody see this as circular reasoning? You would need evidence outside of DNA and homology to let you know which way the evidence points, because DNA and homology can be true for either cause, potentially. So you would need evidence outside of that. And tonight we're going to see some of the evidence outside of that that's going to show that it's a common designer, not a common ancestor. We'll get to that later. So let's sum up point 2. What does science say about God? What's the answer? This is the interactive portion of the program. Zip, zero, nada, because science doesn't say anything. Scientists say things. And you've got to evaluate as to whether the scientist is interpreting the data properly. Okay, so now let's move on to how does science and atheism conflict? I'm going to put up a belief that many atheists believe today because they're naturalists, meaning they don't think there's any supernatural or immaterial realm. They think everything's made of molecules. You're made of molecules. You just have a brain, not a mind. You just have a body, not a soul. You're just a molecular machine. You're just a moist robot. Every thought you have is the result of the laws of physics, in other words. In fact, that's one of their claims. All thoughts are determined by the laws of physics. If someone were to say this to you, what question would you ask them? You could ask, how do you know that? Well, you're on the right track, but there's a more direct way of getting to that. Is that caused by the laws of physics? Exactly. You say, well, is that one too? Because if that is caused by the laws of physics, why should I believe it? In other words, if you're no different than a Coke can fizzing, why should you believe anything you think? Why should I believe anything I think? If we're just molecular machines, if we're just moist robots, we shouldn't be able to think. We shouldn't be able to figure out what's true outside of our skulls. But we can. Now, when we were here a couple of years ago, we talked about this. We said what you got to do is turn the claim on itself. Remember when we talked about, you might not have been here a couple of years ago. Remember when people say things like, there is no truth. You should ask them a question. What should the question be? Is that true? Is it true that there's no truth? Because if it's true that there's no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true, but it claims to be true. Can anybody see this is a self-defeating statement? It would be like me saying I can't speak a word in English. If I were to say I can't speak a word in English, what would you say? You're using English to say it. The same thing's going on here. When they say all thoughts are determined by the laws of physics, well, then that thought is too, so why should I believe it? In fact, nobody pointed this out better than C.S. Lewis, so I'm just going to quote him. C.S. Lewis pointed out that atheism makes reason and science impossible. Because if we're molecular machines, reason and science don't exist. And it's a 2-page quote, so track with Lewis on this. Here's what he said. He said, suppose there were no intelligence behind the universe. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. Thought is merely the byproduct of some atoms within my skull. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I can't believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. Boom! As John Madden would say, right? You can't say it better than that. If we're molecular machines, we can't even believe anything we think, including the thought that atheism's true. In fact, an atheist by the name of J.B.S. Haldane, an actual evolutionist, realized this when he realized that robots can't reason, so why believe anything? In fact, here's what he said. If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. Do you see the problem? In fact, Daniel Dennett, who recently just passed away, he was a new atheist, he said this: consciousness is an illusion. One wonders if he was conscious when he said this. Consciousness is an illusion? In order to know consciousness is an illusion, you'd have to get outside of your own consciousness. Like, for example, how do you know that a dream is just a dream? You gotta wake up, right? That's the only way you can say, oh, that was just a dream. If you're in the dream, you don't know if it's a dream. You gotta get outside the dream to say, oh, that's just a dream. And for Dennett to say consciousness is an illusion, he'd have to get outside of his own consciousness. He'd have to get out of the matrix, so to speak, right? In order to say, oh, that's the matrix. Oh, that's just an illusion. He'd have to be God to know this. You see the crazy extent some atheists will go to try and explain things that are self-evident, that you have consciousness? They'll just say it's an illusion. Here's the main problem. Atheists exempt themselves from their own theories. They think everybody's a molecular machine, except them. They're not molecular machines. Some of them say consciousness is an illusion, except they don't think their consciousness is an illusion. Just yours is, you ignorant Christian. They're defeating themselves by their own theories. Here's another self-defeating statement you're going to hear. All truth comes from science. What's the problem with this one? If you turn the claim on itself, what question are you going to ask that person? Yeah, you're going to say, does that truth come from science? Can you go in the laboratory and prove all truth comes from science? No, that's not a scientific conclusion. That's a philosophical assertion. That's not even a statement from science. That's a statement about science. And by the way, most of what you know has nothing to do with science. The most important things in life have nothing to do with science. Honey, do you love me? Yeah. Why? I don't know. Let's run an experiment. No! What you got to do is turn the claim on itself. You say, wait, Frank, what can't science explain? Now, I'm going to put a lot on the screen here. We can't talk about all of it, but this is a drawing from the book Stealing from God that my friend J. Warner Wallace drew for me. It's pointing out that whenever you're doing science, there's a lot of non-science philosophical presuppositions you're bringing to the table. First of all, when you're doing science, you got to figure out, how am I going to frame this experiment or historical investigation? Then, how am I going to conduct this experiment or historical investigation? Then, how am I going to interpret this evidence? Just like the OJ trial, right? How do you interpret the evidence? And whenever you're doing that, you're bringing principles to the table that you can't prove by science. Like, for example, the laws of logic. Can you prove them by science? No, you need them in order to do science. How about the laws of math? Can you prove them by science? No, you need those laws in order to do science. How about free will? Can you prove that by science? No, you have to assume you have free will in order to do science. How about realism? That's the idea that your mind can tell you the truth about what's outside your skull. Can you prove that by science? No, you have to assume that in order to do science. How about orderly natural laws? Can you prove them by science? No. You have to assume they exist already in order to do science. And that's the one I want to talk about. Orderly natural laws. Where do they come from? So to sum up point 2, how does science and atheism conflict? It conflicts because if atheism's true, you can't follow your own reasoning because you're just a molecular machine. And if you can't reason, you can't do science. So science and atheism conflict, not science and Christianity. Now the key question is, why does science need God? And in order to do this, we have to go all the way back to you in the womb at 11 weeks. Hang on, let me see if anything's happened. Not yet, first baby. Takes a while. They went to the hospital at 11 Eastern last night. So what is that? 15 hours ago? Question, is this animal, mineral, vegetable, or human? Human. In fact, let's go back even further than 11 weeks. Let's go all the way back to when your mother and your father got together to conceive you. Have you guys had this talk before? I see some young people in here, so I'll try and be discreet. I also see some older people in here, so I'll try and be discreet as well, just in case you've forgotten how this works. When your mother and your father got together to conceive you, your mother unconsciously perfumed her egg to attract your father, and then your father sent the entire population of the United States, 300 million soldiers, toward your mother's egg. And then there was a race, and you won. Don't let anyone ever tell you you're not special. You beat out 300 million others. You have blown away anything Michael Phelps has done. Now, to see some of you limp in here earlier makes it hard for me to believe you were the fastest soldier in the gene pool, but you were. Now, your soldier was 20 to 30 times smaller than a grain of salt, yet it contained half of the 3.2 billion letter genome. Your software program, we call it DNA, all the letters in the right order, and your mother's egg was about the size of a period at the end of a sentence in an average book, and it contained the other half of the 3.2 billion letter genome, your software program, your DNA, all those letters in the right order. And when your soldier and your egg came together, a new 100% genetic human being was created. You know, you have not received any more genetic information from this point till right now. Your genetic information has just duplicated itself. In fact, there were only 4 things separating you from adulthood: time, air, water, and food. Those are the same 4 things that separate a 2-year-old from adulthood. Does this have implications on the abortion issue? Yeah, I think it does. We don't kill the 2-year-old. Why do we kill the unborn child in the womb? Genetically, it's the same. Amen. You say, wait a minute, Frank. You can't legislate morality. All right, no extra charge for this, friends. This was the subject of our first book, creatively titled Legislating Morality. All laws legislate morality. Every law declares one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. You can't think of a law that doesn't legislate morality. The only question is, whose morality will we legislate? And when people say, well, don't impose your morality on me, I say, why not? Would that be immoral? Because you're imposing your morality on me right now. You're saying I ought not impose ought nots, but you're imposing that ought not on me. Why do you get to impose ought nots, but I don't? Actually, the better answer is this. When somebody says, don't impose your morality on me, I think you ought to say this. This isn't my morality. I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't make up the fact that murder's wrong, that abortion's wrong, that rape is wrong, that theft is wrong, that you ought not mutilate the sexual organs of children. I didn't make up the fact that men were made for women and women were made for men, and the best way to perpetuate and stabilize society, which is the reason the government's involved in marriage to begin with, is to legally recognize that man-woman relationship over every other relationship. I didn't make any of this stuff up. This isn't my morality. This isn't your morality. This just happens to be the morality. The one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The one the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 2 said, the Gentiles are not of the law written on their hearts. Look, this isn't my morality. It's not your morality, it's the morality. And if you have a problem with the morality, you don't have a problem with me. I didn't make it up. You have a problem with the Creator upon whose nature this morality is derived. All right, no extra charge for that. Let's go back to this. From this point till right now, an astonishing construction project began taking place. Cells began multiplying at a rate of 4,000 cells per second. Brain cells began multiplying at a rate of 100,000 cells per second. For most of you anyway. Some cells became brain cells, others lung cells, others heart cells. How did they know how to do this? Nobody knows. Some cells went so far across you to become what they needed to become that it would be equivalent to you today walking across the United States alone. And that construction project continues to this very moment. You just made 4 million new red blood cells. You just made another 4 million new red blood cells. You just made another, knock it off. I mean, are you thinking about this? Or are you going, wait a minute, Frank, I've got to concentrate. New red blood cells. No, this is just happening. How is it happening? Aristotle noticed something 2,400 years ago. Of course, he didn't know anything about blood cells, but he did notice that all of nature is going in a direction. For example, why does an acorn, if it's properly nourished, always go in the direction of becoming an oak tree? Why doesn't it become an elm tree or a birch tree or a seahorse? You say, well, it's programmed to become an oak tree. Well, who programmed it? And by the way, is an acorn conscious? Is an acorn in the ground thinking, what do I have to do to become an oak tree? No. If it's not conscious, if it doesn't have a mind of its own, but it reliably goes in a direction, there must be an external mind directing it toward an end. That's what Aristotle called the unmoved mover. Thomas Aquinas came along in the 1200s AD and he said, this is going to be my fifth way to argue for God. That all of nature's going in a direction. If it's going in a direction, it's consistent and persistent going in this direction. There must be a mind directing it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a historical cause, like a Big Bang cause or God who created the universe cause. This is not that cause. This is the cause that exists every single second the universe exists. It's being directed by a mind. In fact, God is to the universe what a band is to music. The band earlier was playing, creating, and sustaining the music. What happened to the music the second the band stopped playing? Music's over. Same thing is true here. God creates the universe, and he creates you, and he creates the natural laws that govern all this, and he sustains the universe, and he sustains you and the natural laws that govern it. If he were to pull his hand away, the universe would go out of existence, and so would you. This is why the Apostle Paul says things like, in him we live and move and have our being, and Christ holds all things together. And the writer of Hebrews says, God sustains all things by his powerful word. There's a sustaining cause right now. I mean, ask yourself the question. Science requires nature to be goal-directed. Why is nature goal-directed? Why are these natural laws? Why do they do what they do over and over again, consistently and persistently? Well, one agnostic physicist by the name of Paul Davies, who teaches at Arizona State University, asked his atheistic colleagues a question. Basically, why are there orderly natural laws? And almost 20 years ago, he wrote a column in the New York Times, which he called Taking Science on Faith. He said, you know, we talk about natural laws doing all these things. Where do the laws come from? You know, he got a lot of hate in his email box from his atheistic colleagues. Here's how he summarizes their response. Over the years, I've often asked my physicist colleagues why the laws of physics are what they are. The answers vary from, that's not a scientific question that nobody knows. The favorite reply is, there is no reason they are what they are. They just are. Ladies and gentlemen, where do laws come from? Laws come from lawgivers. There are no laws without lawgivers. In fact, here's what God does. God not only creates the universe, but he sustains the universe. And he also intervenes on occasion through miracles. In fact, the only way we could detect when God was intervening through a miracle is if he sustained the natural laws consistently. Because without natural laws, you would never be able to detect the special act of God. If things were chaotic, first of all, we wouldn't exist, but if they were chaotic and we couldn't predict reliable cause and effect, we couldn't discover a miracle. Miracles presuppose the backdrop of regular events that happen over and over again. So God not only creates, he also sustains, and he intervenes at certain points to tell us this person speaks for God. So you know what? Paul was right. How do we know God exists? We know through his effects. We know he exists because we understand from what has been made that there has to be a creator, there has to be a sustainer. And that's why science needs God. There'd be no way to do science unless God existed. There'd be no way to detect reliable cause and effect unless there was reliable cause and effect. And our minds weren't just molecular machines. Our minds could actually know the truth outside of our skull. So let's sum it all up. What is science? A search for causes. There are two types of causes. There are natural causes and intelligent causes, and two types of science. There's an historical science and an empirical science. And historical science is what we're talking about here. What happened in the past? What does science say about God? What does it say about God? Nothing. Science doesn't say anything about anything. Scientists say things. Now tonight we're going to see there's evidence from science that properly interpreted points to a God, but science itself doesn't say a word. How does science and atheism conflict? Because if atheism is true, we're just molecular machines. We can't even reason, much less do science. Science is predicated on a reasonable human being and orderly natural laws that can be detected. And why does science need God? For that very reason.